Welcome, everyone. This is the fourth installment of the 2018 CUAHSI Fall Cyberseminar series. Unfortunately, after this one, we only have one more left, so I'm glad you stayed and kept on joining them. So some housekeeping items before we begin. I'm Catherine Schleff. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with CUAHSI, and I've been the organizer of this series. The talk will be approximately 45 minutes, and there'll be time for questions at the end, which I'll moderate. You'll notice you're muted to reduce feedback noise, and if you have any issues or questions during the talk, please message me or the CUAHSI staff, and we'll do our best to resolve them for you. Now, to our speaker and the exciting talk we have planned today. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Mariam Allam, who is currently a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Cairo University and her PhD from MIT, all in civil engineering. In her research, Mariam tackles the difficult questions of water resources management in highly contentious and important international river basins. I'm excited to see what she shares on this topic today. In addition to being a great researcher, she always has a smile and is really willing to laugh, which is great for cheering up other people's spirits in the office. And a little fun fact about her, she has a passion for exercise. If you want to distract her from research, you just have to ask her a fitness question. But that aside, thank you, Mariam, for agreeing to give a talk today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you for introduction. And yeah, exercise is good. So hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about the optimal land and water allocation to agriculture and hydropower in the Upper Blue Nile Basin. But before I get into that, let's first talk about this beautiful picture. This photo is a photo of the Seasat Falls right at the headwaters of the Blue Nile Basin in Ethiopia at Lake Tana. Lake Tana is considered the source of life in the Upper Blue Nile Basin, and I think it's the source of life for the whole Blue Nile. A little bit of an introduction. The Nile River is one of the longest rivers in the world, shared by 11 countries. It has three main tributaries: the White Nile, the Atbara River, and the Blue Nile. As you can see from the hydrograph here, the Blue Nile contributes about 75% of the total Nile flow in reaching Egypt at Aswan. The Blue Nile originates again in Ethiopia in the Upper Blue Nile Basin, and then the flow comes out from the border of Ethiopia and goes into Sudan and Egypt. So the Blue Nile waters has been shared or is shared by the three countries. Now let me give you a brief historical introduction to how the situation is between the three countries. So in the period between 1891 and 1906, all the treaties that happened in that period were tailored upon securing water demands for cotton agriculture in Egypt. Basically, Egypt was the big cotton farm for Great Britain, and what was important at that time is securing water demands for that. The 1925 treaty was the first treaty to actually acknowledge that the Upper Blue Nile Basin inhabitants in Ethiopia actually do have the right to use the water in the Upper Blue Nile Basin, but only for domestic purposes. The 1929 and the 1959 treaties are the treaties which spurred all the problems ever since. They stated clearly that there should be no construction works on the Nile upstream of the two countries, Egypt and Sudan, and they have allocated the Nile water between the two countries, where 55.5 cubic kilometers goes to Egypt and 18.5 goes to Sudan. Of course, after the 1959 treaty, Ethiopia was offended that it wasn't even included in the treaty. And so in 1960, Ethiopia invited the US Bureau of Reclamation to have a detailed study on how to develop the water resources in the Upper Blue Nile Basin. And the study took 4 years, and they came up with 4 hydropower reservoirs and a few irrigation schemes. The hydropower reservoirs are Border, Mindaya, Mabel, and Karadobi. Until 2010, none of the reservoirs were proceeded with. However, after the Egyptian Revolution and in 2011, Ethiopia suddenly announced the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and directly diverted the flow to build the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And currently, the construction is almost halfway complete. Ever since, the three countries, whenever they tried to sit on a table and actually talk together about the situation and how to move forward, they the only thing that happens is the failure of those negotiations. So that is the historical context. Now, take a moment, and I would like you to put yourself in the shoes of a decision maker in the Upper Blue Nile Basin in Ethiopia. What are the major challenges in the Upper Blue Nile Basin, and what would a decision maker need to make a decision? So the questions that a decision maker might ask, or the basic questions to ask, is what is the current state of my water resources in the basin? What is the potential for expanding agriculture? And how do I utilize those resources? What is optimal? What is not optimal? Should I go with hydropower or agriculture? As you can notice, all these questions are all unilaterally moved, as in like I'm only interested in my own net benefit. And then after I figure that out, maybe I can look into win-win-win opportunities if they do exist. In order to answer those major challenges or questions, we're going to use a framework that I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But before I get into that, have these questions been attempted to be, did anybody attempt to answer those questions before? The previous studies can be divided into three different categories. The first category is a study that went into the basin and studied the potential for development, which is the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation study, the godfather of all the studies. The second category are the studies that took the output of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation report and created a model that consists of nodes and links and tried to maximize the net benefits from those projects and determine what is the impact on the downstream countries. While the third category are studies that looked into the GERD, which was recently announced, but they only looked into how to fill the GERD without having such a huge impact on the downstream countries, which is kind of a short-term problem, while we're interested in the long-term solution. So the framework that we're going to talk about today kind of combines the three categories together. We first answer the first question: what is the current situation of my basin? And what is the potential for growing or expanding agriculture through delineating arability maps through a multi-criteria GIS-based platform? And then try to utilize the water and land resources optimally between agriculture and hydropower. So first, the data assimilation. Why do we need a data assimilation model? When we try to look into the evaporation over the Upper Blue Nile Basin, this figure shows a comparison between three different data sets, the long-term average monthly evaporation over the basin. And as you can see, the only thing that data sets agree on is actually to not agree at all. They do not agree on the temporal scale, they do not agree on the annual depth, and they definitely don't agree on the spatial evaporation distribution over the basin. So in order to get a feeling of what is the current situation is, we create a data assimilation model that simulates precipitation, evaporation, potential evaporation, runoff, and terrestrial water storage into a mass and energy balance model constrained by the topography, by crop data, radiation data, and soil water holding capacity to produce consistent Upper Blue Nile Basin hydrology and to actually know what the evaporation depth is over the basin. These are the main results from the data assimilation model. This is a comparison between the observed data using remote sense satellite data and the output from the data assimilation model. And this is also a comparison between the evaporation from our model output of evaporation and CUAHSI, which has not been used as an input to the data assimilation model. While these two figures show a comparison between the correlation of evapotranspiration from our model and ALEXI to NDVI, it makes sense that the correlation should be high since if the more vegetation you have, evapotranspiration increases. So question number 2 is, what is the potential to expand agriculture in the basin? In order to address that concern, we used a GIS multi-criteria analysis using the FAO land evaluation framework, which basically finds suitable soils for agriculture, suitable slopes for agriculture, and suitable temperatures, and aggregated together, that delineates the arable maps. However, as you can see, this method clearly is highly dependent on the input data used into the framework. So the first thing is, what is the most suitable input data to delineate the arable maps? So we looked into the 2 different topography data sets over the area, and we found this is just a comparison between ASTER and SRTM, and the lower figure shows a comparison between what is arable as green and what is not arable according to these 2 data sets. And on the third plot, we can find a specially ordered 8-meter DTM compared to the other 2 data sets and the resultant arability map. And as you can see, SRTM does a much better job in this case. Another screening analysis that we tried is using the current or modest land use map. We compared what is currently cropped to the slopes that are arable according to the 2 different data sets. And according to ASTER, most of the lands that are currently cropped as we're speaking are not even suitable for agriculture. So we decided to move forward with the SRTM DEM. Similarly, these are also a comparison between 2 different soil data sets, the Harmonized World Soil Database and the AFSIS data set. And for the 3 properties shown here, pH, CEC, and organic carbon, one of the data sets is saying go right and the other data set is saying go left. So another similar screening analysis was done. And again, AFSIS agreed a lot more with the current crop maps or crop plans than the Harmonized World Soil Database. As soon as we agreed on these 2 data sets, these are just an example of the delineated arability maps of the Upper Blue Nile Basin for 3 crop groups: cereals, legumes, and oilseeds. And by crop groups here, I mean that cereals means wheat, barley, or includes wheat, barley, millet, sorghum, etc. Legumes includes beans, chickpeas, peas, etc., and so on. The green color here are soils that are highly suitable for growing the crop group. Yellow is moderately suitable. Orange is moderately suitable, and yellow is limited suitability, and white cannot grow this crop group at all. We also, in this analysis, we find the amount of soil enhancement or soil inputs, whether it's fertilizers or limestones or nitrogen or phosphorus needed to improve one soil suitability class to another, but for the sake of time, we're not showing it here. So now we know what is the current situation of the water resources and what is the potential for expanding the agriculture. These 2 outputs are going to be used as an input to a water land allocation model that tries to maximize the net benefits from agriculture. And that is done through maximizing net benefits from rain-fed agriculture alone, or maximizing both rain-fed and irrigated agriculture, constrained by mass and energy balance, land constraints, and more importantly, the crop water model. In the crop water model, the yield is a function of the suitability level that we delineated previously in the delineation maps. And then the suitability of a soil is also a function of the soil inputs. So the model has the option of choosing whether or not to invest in improving a soil suitability class from one class to another and pay the cost corresponding to that. Last but not least, for rain-fed agriculture, the yield is a function of the water stress. And that's because a farmer does not know before growing the crop whether he will receive the total amount of rainfall required to grow the crop or not. So if the amount of rainfall that the farmer receives to grow the crop is not the optimal amount that the crop would actually need, that would reduce the yield corresponding to that. This is the output of the model. This is a comparison between the optimal cropland allocation and the MODIS cropland according to 2009. And I wouldn't focus so much on the numbers because like prices change every day, but you can, what I want you to focus on is that the input costs for soil enhancements are really high. So some of the soils need a lot of inputs such as fertilizers, limestone, sulfur, phosphorus, and nitrogen, but also it's totally worth it in the end. There's another cost associated with the optimal cropland allocation, though. It's a reduction in the total runoff. So the total runoff out of the Upper Blue Nile Basin is reduced by 7.55 cubic kilometers based on that change in the land use, which might not be the happiest news the downstream countries would like to hear. These are also the outputs from the model, the yield, area harvested, and the revenues from the different crop groups. And the take-home message from that figure, more than the numbers, is the star crop in rain-fed agriculture is found to be Teff. The model chooses to grow 8 million hectares of the Upper Blue Nile Basin land and to allocate them to Teff. In order to give you a little mental break, what is Teff? So Teff, also known as Irrigated Teff, that's a Greek name, which means the grass of love. 6.2 million farmers in Ethiopia grow Teff, and Teff has been grown in Ethiopia for over 3,000 years. It has a lot of benefits. Now, back to the question is it reasonable that the model wants to grow 8 million hectares as Teff? Let's see about that. So injera is the way Ethiopians like to eat Teff. It's kind of almost kind of a bread, and they put the vegetables over it and they eat it. It's really good. But also Ethiopia exports Teff to USA, Yemen, UAE, Djibouti, Iceland, Israel, and other countries. And Teff is a very highly national crop in Ethiopia. If you look into this figure, these are the market prices, whether the Ethiopian market price or the local market price of Teff in Ethiopia. And in 2012, the exports of Teff went really high that there was a shortage in the local supply of Teff. And because of that shortage, almost actually two prices met, and almost the local price, the market price, went above the Ethiopian export price. And at that point, Ethiopia has decided to stop or ban the export of Teff. This is how important Teff is in Ethiopia. Another interesting fact is that the Upper Blue Nile Basin represents 30% of the total country's area. However, it grows about 70% of the total consumption of Teff for Ethiopia. So now into irrigation, irrigated agriculture. We, in our model, we screened 11 irrigation reservoirs that were suggested or proposed in the master plan of Ethiopia. And our model finds only 3 of them as economically attractive. 2 of them are Rib and Gilgilabye in the Lake Tana sub-basin, and the third is Dabana in the southern part of the basin. And the model finds that building Dabana only to half of its proposed capacity makes economic sense. Now, in the irrigation master plan, they don't say if there is like another use for that structure specifically. Maybe there is, and that's why their proposed capacity is higher. But if this reservoir is used only for agriculture, then it should be built to half of its capacity. And again, the star crops in the case of irrigated agriculture are coffee and sugarcane, basically more towards sugarcane. Another thing that we wanted to test for with our model is to cooperate or to not to cooperate. So the no cooperation scenario is, what if the 3 countries or what if Ethiopia decides to move with unilateral development? And that was what we were just talking about previously. But to cooperate this scenario, let's just imagine that in a utopian, perfect world, the three countries actually managed to get on a table and talk together about investing in the rain-fed agriculture in Ethiopia, since it has this huge potential, and sharing the costs and benefits and the yields from that. And in return, the three countries agree as well that the Upper Blue Nile Basin flows should be maintained, as in the 7.55 cubic kilometers cost of flow reduction corresponding to rain-fed agriculture expansion would not happen based on that agreement. What would that mean? And so we ran that, and we found that the net benefits would be reduced by about $600 million corresponding to that, and the expanded agriculture goes from 50% of the basin area to 44% only. But it's not only a reduction in the area, it's also a shift in the cropping pattern. So some areas that were allocated to grow teff, which is profitable and important for Ethiopia, were replaced by legumes, which were more water efficient, and at the same time, they didn't generate that much net benefits. Moving on and bringing the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam into the picture. So in order to address the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and to look into the optimal operation policy for it, we looked into how to produce a maximum uniform monthly hydropower operation. And we chose that objective function, as we know that the objective of building that reservoir is actually to sell hydropower for the neighboring countries and generate profits or benefits for Ethiopia. And in order to do that, we use the objective function of a minimization objective function that minimizes the deviation of the monthly hydropower production from the GERD from the maximum hydropower capacity of the plant. And we find that the reservoir usually empties, or not empties, but the reservoir storage goes a little bit lower right before the rainy season starts, and then fills up again in order to maintain a relatively uniform flow through the turbines and to maintain a maximum uniform monthly hydropower generation. So is there a trade-off between hydropower and agriculture? Of course there is. We know already that expanding agriculture reduces the runoff, and if the runoff decreases, then the flow going through the turbines should decrease. So there is a trade-off. But who's actually the winner there? The winner is the agriculture for now. And the reason this is happening is the location of the GERD. Since the GERD is a huge hydropower facility and it's located right at the border between Sudan and Ethiopia, any agriculture expansion happening here upstream of the reservoir translates into a cost in terms of the runoff passing through the GERD turbines. This would have not been that prevalent if Ethiopia has moved on with 4 smaller hydropower reservoirs and the agriculture expansion is divided, or the cost is divided between those 4 reservoirs. But yeah, another figure that explains the trade-off a little bit more, obviously, is this figure. So the horizontal axis represents the additional agricultural water consumption, where if you go right from the 0, that means you're using more water as compared to the current situation in agriculture. If you go to the left, that means you're losing agricultural land and you're allocating the water to hydropower instead, or you're generating more runoff, basically. The vertical axis shows the additional net benefit currently we're actually losing lands and allocating the water to hydropower instead. If we move to the left, as you can see, the slope starts very steep in the beginning, and that is because there is a huge potential right now to expand the agriculture, a lot of highly suitable soils, a lot of suitable lands, and as we move further and further, those lands are exploited, and we're left off with moderately suitable lands until we reach a point where all the, like, whatever you consume in water, you're actually not generating any more net benefits, because to invest in those lands, you need to pay so much costs that the costs cancel the benefits. If you look into the blue line as well, this is the revenue lost from hydropower corresponding to that additional water agricultural consumption. So if you consume more water in agriculture, you lose more revenue from hydropower and vice versa. In order to find the maximum net benefit, we need to find the maximum difference between those two curves, which happens exactly at our optimal solution of 7.55 reduction in the Upper Blue Nile basin flow from the long-term average case. This is also another interesting figure. This figure attests for the sensitivity of our optimal solution to Teff price, since Teff was the star crop of rainfed agriculture. So in the horizontal axis, these are different market Teff prices, and the vertical axis is the optimal hydropower pricing corresponding to that. So this line divides the figure into two zones. Whatever below that line is the agriculture-dominated zone. That if we're here, then allocating water to agriculture, it makes much more economic sense than allocating it to hydropower. While if we fall in the hydropower dominated zone, then allocating or saving the water to generate more runoff for hydropower generation makes much more economic sense than allocating it to agriculture. The current Teff market price is $550 per ton, and the current proposed hydropower pricing is 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And as you can see, it currently falls in the agriculture dominated zone. And in order for Ethiopia to neutralize this trade-off between agriculture and hydropower, they have to price the hydropower at 13 cents per kilowatt hour at least, which is kind of equivalent to the price of generating hydropower using fossil fuels. To summarize, the framework consisted of data assimilation, arable maps delineation, and a land water allocation model that optimizes net benefits and hydropower production from the GERD. And also, accurate data and science are both crucial for decision making. Most basins with untapped potentials, like the Upper Blue Nile Basin, have maximum conflict and are data scarce. And so using satellite and remote sense data can basically help decision makers make an informed decision, but also we have to use these data with a little bit of grain of salt, because they are least calibrated in these areas as they are data scarce. Hence the need for data assimilation models. Another thing is rainfed agriculture has a huge potential in Africa specifically. With some soil enhancements and investing in agriculture, in Ethiopia, rainfed agriculture can have a huge potential. And last but not least, this whole presentation was formulated about maximizing net benefits, but it's not always about money. So I'm aware that there are other aspects that can be maximized as well, but this is kind of a framework to guide the way to a win-win opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you, Mariam. Appreciated your presentation. I think we have a question already. So one person is asking, what do you mean by soil enhancement? They also said you gave a nice presentation. So.
Thank you. Yeah, soil enhancement inputs dependent on like the area. So let me just go back to that slide. sorry. So here it is. So for instance, these are the soil properties, or three of the soil properties in the Upper Blue Nile Basin. So one of the areas here, whatever is red, means it's too acidic to grow crops. So one of the soil enhancement strategies in this area is to actually add limestone to move it from one productivity class to another. But this specific soil property is aggregated with other properties such as the CEC and organic carbon just in this slide, but also it can be adding more nitrogen, it can be adding more phosphorus, or like these kind of soil like soil inputs to improve the soil. I hope that answered the questions.
So the follow-up to that is, do you advise the use of fertilizers then?
Yeah.
Maybe can you expand on that a bit?
Well, according to the model, there were some areas in the Upper Blue Nile Basin that actually needed treating treatment of fertilizers that are enhanced in a certain way to move the productivity from one level to another. So if we're talking pure net benefits, then using the fertilizers that are phosphorus rich or nitrogen rich in some areas can make your productivity like spike. So yeah, that's my answer.
And I guess I'll just follow up on that. Can you give me a sense of, you were talking about rain-fed versus irrigated, but how much of this is large scale, like what you would see in the American West, versus kind of just small farmer scale or individual scale?
In my analysis, I tried to group most of the delineated arable maps into mostly large scale streams because of the scale of my pixel. So I didn't go like into the scale of a farmer level. So mostly they were large schemes.
Okay, and then kind of again follow up from the same person. How do you reconcile the use of fertilizers with water quality? Did you look at water quality at all, or do you know of any studies that are looking at water quality, the impacts that it would have?
No, I didn't. But that's an interesting question. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? I guess I'll ask one in the meantime while people are thinking or writing. What about, I guess, are there any issues with extremes, hydro extremes, so either droughts or floods in this area? And, is there did you try, let's say, like a worst case scenario in your model, or is that included in the time series?
Didn't show that, but yes, we ran the model for the driest case scenario and the wettest case as well, and the area we found that in the driest case scenario, if you decide to invest in the amount of land according to the average, there will be a failure in that case of about 20% because of like the reduction in rainfall. However, the wet case scenario did not add much because the water in the average case is not the limiting factor. It's more of the land. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Are there any other questions from people listening in? I'll just give it a minute. All right, well, thank you very much, Mariam. I really appreciated your presentation, and thank you everyone for listening. And we hope to see you back here next week for our very last seminar. So thanks again, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye.
Bye.